In 1998, a father and his 12-year-old son boarded a flight from Seattle to Boston on Christmas Eve. Their boarding passes scanned, their seats confirmed. But when the plane landed 5 hours later, both seats were empty. No bodies were ever found. No explanation was ever given. 26 years later, a baggage handler discovers something impossible in the walls of the airport's oldest terminal. A discovery that will unravel everything we thought we knew about that Christmas Eve disappearance. If you're fascinated by true mysteries that defy explanation, subscribe now and join us as we investigate cases that blur the line between the explicable and the impossible. The snow fell thick and heavy over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport on the afternoon of December 24, 1998. Inside Terminal B, travelers rushed through the decorated concourses, their arms laden with wrapped presents and overstuffed luggage. Christmas music played softly through overhead speakers, nearly drowned out by gate announcements and the rumble of jets taking off into the gray winter sky. Claire Brennan stood near Gate B7, watching her husband Richard and their son Owen disappear into the jetway. Richard had turned back one last time, his hand raised in a final wave, his familiar smile creased with the exhaustion of the past difficult months. Owen, small for his 12 years, had pressed his face against the jetway window, his breath fogging the glass as he waved goodbye to his mother. Claire had stayed behind. Her father was dying in a hospice facility in Tacoma, and she couldn't leave him alone for Christmas. Richard and Owen would spend the holiday with Richard's sister in Boston, then return in 3 days. It was supposed to be simple, a brief separation during an already painful time. She had watched until they were completely out of sight, then gathered her coat and headed back through security, back to her father's bedside, back to the slow, aching wait that had defined the past 2 weeks. At 6:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Flight 2547 touched down at Logan International Airport in Boston. The passengers deplaned in the usual chaos of holiday travel, streaming into the terminal to embrace waiting families or rush toward baggage claim. Richard's sister, Helen Moss, waited at the arrivals gate, a handmade welcome sign clutched in her hands. She waited as the crowd thinned. She waited as the last stragglers emerged. She waited as the jetway door finally closed and a gate agent began preparing for the next departure. Richard and Owen never appeared. Airport security reviewed the boarding records. Both boarding passes had been scanned. Seat 14A and 14B had been assigned to Richard and Owen Brennan. The flight attendants confirmed that all passengers had been accounted for during the safety demonstration and beverage service. But somewhere between Seattle and Boston, between departure and arrival, a father and son had simply ceased to exist. The fluorescent lights of the Seattle-Tacoma Airport Maintenance Office cast harsh shadows across Detective Sarah Chen's face as she studied the photographs spread across the conference table. 26 years had passed since the Brennan disappearance, but the case file remained remarkably thin. Missing persons reports, witness statements that led nowhere, a trail of investigative dead ends that had eventually gone cold. Sarah had been a rookie patrol officer when Richard and Owen Brennan vanished. Now, at 49, she headed the cold case unit for the Port of Seattle Police Department, and the Brennan case had haunted her entire career. She had requested the file 7 times over the years, always hoping that new technology or a fresh perspective might crack it open. Each time, she had found nothing. But today was different. Marcus Webb, the airport's assistant maintenance director, sat across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee. He was in his 60s, with gray stubble and deep-set eyes that hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Sarah had received his call 72 hours ago, his voice shaking as he described what his crew had discovered. "Walk me through it again," Sarah said, her pen poised over her notebook. "From the beginning." Marcus cleared his throat. "We've been renovating Terminal B. The whole north wing is being gutted and rebuilt. It's the oldest part of the airport, original construction from the 60s. Most of the structure is sound, but there are sections that need complete overhaul." He paused, taking a long drink of coffee. 3 days ago, my crew was demolishing a section of wall near the old gate B7. That gate hasn't been used in 15 years. When the C concourse was built, they rerouted all the traffic and just sealed off that whole section. It's been sitting empty since 2009. Sarah nodded, already familiar with the airport's layout changes. She had studied the floor plans obsessively over the years, trying to understand how two people could vanish from such a controlled environment. We pulled down the drywall, Marcus continued, and found a hollow space behind it. Not unusual. Buildings this old have all kinds of gaps and voids in the walls. But this space was different. It was deliberately constructed. Someone had built a false wall, maybe 2 feet deep, running about 20 feet along the corridor. Sarah's pulse quickened. What was inside? Marcus met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her stomach tighten. Fear. Confusion. Something that looked almost like grief. 2 bodies, he said quietly. An adult male and a child. Both mummified. The dry air and sealed environment had preserved them. They were wearing winter clothes from the 90s. And there was luggage. 2 carry-on bags. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. We found identification in one of the bags, Marcus continued. A wallet belonging to Richard Brennan. The child was wearing a watch, on the back engraved, "To Owen, love Mom and Dad." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. After 26 years of nothing, Richard and Owen Brennan had been inside the airport the entire time. Not on the plane, not in Boston. Here, hidden behind a wall barely 50 feet from where they had last been seen alive. The medical examiner has the bodies now, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. What's the preliminary cause of death? Marcus shook his head. That's the thing that doesn't make sense. There's no obvious trauma, no visible injuries. But the ME says their positioning is strange. They're seated, backs against the wall, like they were arranged there. And there's something else. He reached into a folder and pulled out several photographs, sliding them across the table. Sarah picked up the first image and felt her breath catch. The photograph showed the interior of the hidden space. 2 figures sat slumped against the far wall, their bodies desiccated but eerily intact. But what made Sarah's skin crawl was the floor around them. Someone had drawn symbols in what appeared to be chalk or paint, intricate geometric patterns that radiated outward from the bodies like a grotesque mandala. The symbols aren't random, Marcus said. One of my guys has a degree in religious studies. He says they're protection sigils, old ones, the kind used in rituals to contain or ward off something. Sarah set down the photograph, her mind racing. Who had access to this area in 1998? That's what I've been trying to piece together, Marcus replied. Gate B7 was active then, so you had passengers, airline staff, cleaning crews, maintenance workers. Hundreds of people passed through that gate every day. But this section of wall, the false panel, it would have required construction knowledge. Someone who understood the building's structure. Someone who could work unnoticed. Security footage? Long gone. Back then, they only kept tapes for 30 days, unless there was a specific incident. By the time anyone thought to look, assuming they even knew what to look for, the footage had been recycled. Sarah stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the runways where planes taxied through the gray December afternoon. In 3 days, it would be the 26th anniversary of the disappearance. Claire Brennan, if she was still alive, would be 68 years old. She had spent more than half her life not knowing what happened to her husband and son. Now Sarah had to tell her the truth, or at least part of it. The discovery of the bodies answered one question but opened a dozen more. How had Richard and Owen ended up behind that wall? Who had put them there? And why had someone drawn protection symbols around their corpses, as if trying to contain something that might escape? Sarah turned back to Marcus. I need a list of every maintenance worker, contractor and construction crew that had access to Terminal B in December 1998. I need architectural plans, showing every modification made to that area. And I need to speak with Claire Brennan before this hits the news. Marcus nodded grimly. The media's already sniffing around. We've kept it quiet so far, but that won't last. Sarah gathered the photographs and files, her mind already cataloging the steps ahead. She had waited 26 years for a break in this case. Now that it had finally come, she felt no relief, only a deep, unsettling dread that grew stronger with every detail she learned. As she left the maintenance office and walked back through the airport, she passed Gate B7's sealed entrance. The area was cordoned off with construction barriers and yellow tape. Behind that wall, in the darkness, Richard and Owen Brennan had spent 2 decades while the world moved on without them. Sarah paused, staring at the sealed corridor. Somewhere in this building was someone who knew the truth, someone who had built that false wall, who had placed those bodies, who had drawn those symbols, someone who might still be watching. The nursing home sat on a quiet street in Olympia, an hour south of Seattle. Sarah had called ahead, speaking briefly with the facility director to confirm that Claire Brennan was still a resident and mentally competent to receive difficult news. The director had hesitated before answering, her voice careful. "Mrs. Brennan has good days and bad days," she had said. "Today is a good day. But, Detective, you should know that she still talks about them sometimes. About Richard and Owen, as if they might walk through the door any moment." Now Sarah sat in a small visiting room decorated with cheerful watercolors and artificial plants, waiting as a nurse wheeled Claire Brennan into the room. The woman who appeared bore little resemblance to the photographs in the case file. The Claire of 1998 had been a striking woman in her early 40s, with dark hair and an artist's elegant hands. The woman before Sarah now seemed impossibly fragile, her white hair thin, her body diminished by age and grief. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and in them Sarah saw immediate recognition. "You're here about Richard and Owen," Claire said, her voice surprisingly strong. It wasn't a question. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "Yes, Mrs. Brennan. I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Port of Seattle Police. I've been working on your husband and son's case." Claire's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "They told me the case was closed years ago. They said there was nothing more they could do." "The case was never officially closed," Sarah replied gently. "Just suspended pending new evidence. Mrs. Brennan, I need to tell you something. We've made a discovery at the airport." Claire's hands tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move. Then, very quietly, she said, "You found them?" "Yes." "Are they dead?" The bluntness of the question caught Sarah off guard, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, I'm very sorry." Claire nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had always known. "Where?" Sarah explained about the renovation, the hidden space, the bodies behind the wall. She kept her description clinical, factual, leaving out the disturbing details about the symbols and the strange positioning. Those could come later, if necessary. When she finished, Claire was silent for a long time, staring at her hands. Sarah waited, giving the woman space to process. Outside the window, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. "I always knew they didn't make it to Boston," Claire finally said. "Everyone thought I was crazy. The police, Richard's family, even my own sister. They all said I was in denial, that I couldn't accept that Richard had run away, taken Owen somewhere, started a new life." "Did you believe that was possible?" Claire's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Never. Richard loved me. He loved our life, our son. We had problems, yes. What marriage doesn't? But he would never have disappeared without a word, and he certainly would never have taken Owen from me." Sarah pulled out her notebook. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to ask you some questions about the days leading up to their disappearance. I know you've answered these questions before, but sometimes, with fresh perspective, new details emerge." Claire nodded. "Ask whatever you need." "Why were Richard and Owen going to Boston without you?" "My father was dying. Pancreatic cancer. He had maybe a week left. The doctors said. Richard's sister Helen had invited us all for Christmas, but I couldn't leave my dad. Richard understood. He said he and Owen would go, represent the family, come back as soon as they could. How was Richard's mental state that week? Claire considered this carefully. Worried, not about the trip, about me, about my father. Richard was a caretaker by nature. He hated seeing me in pain and being unable to fix it. And Owen? A sad smile crossed Claire's face. Owen was excited. He loved flying. He loved his Aunt Helen. He was at that age where everything was still an adventure. He kept packing and repacking his little suitcase, making sure he had his Game Boy, his favorite books. Sarah made notes, though she had read all of this in previous reports. Did anything unusual happen in the days before their flight? Anyone contact Richard who seemed out of place? Any strange phone calls or visitors? Claire's brow furrowed. There was something. I'd forgotten about it until now. Maybe 2 days before Christmas, Richard got a call on his cell phone. He went outside to take it, which was odd. When he came back in, he seemed shaken. Sarah's pen paused. Did he tell you who called? He said it was someone from his past, from before we met. He seemed troubled by it, but when I pressed him, he said it was nothing important. Just someone asking for money, and he told them no. Did he mention a name? Claire shook her head. I don't think so. Or if he did, I don't remember. This was 26 years ago, Detective. My memory isn't what it was. Sarah made a note to pull Richard Brennan's phone records, though she suspected they were long gone. Still, it was a lead, something that hadn't been in the original investigation files. Mrs. Brennan, what did Richard do for a living? He was an architect, specialized in airport design, actually. That's how we met. I was painting a mural in the new international terminal, and he came by to check on the construction. We started talking and... She trailed off, lost in memory. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Richard designed airports? Yes. He'd worked on projects all over the country. Seattle-Tacoma was one of his favorites. He knew that building inside and out. The pieces were starting to shift, forming a picture Sarah didn't want to see. An architect who knew the airport's hidden spaces, a mysterious phone call, a sudden trip on Christmas Eve. Did Richard ever mention Terminal B specifically? The older section? Claire thought for a moment. He worked on some of the renovations there in the early 90s. He was always proud of that work. He said the original designers had done something special with that building, created spaces within spaces. He admired the ingenuity. Spaces within spaces. Sarah's mind was racing now. Mrs. Brennan, I have to ask this. Is there any possibility that Richard was involved in something he shouldn't have been? Anything that might have put him in danger? Claire's expression hardened. My husband was a good man, Detective. Whatever happened to him and Owen, it wasn't because of anything Richard did wrong. Sarah nodded, but she wasn't convinced. 26 years of investigative experience had taught her that everyone had secrets. Even good men. Especially good men. They talked for another hour, Sarah carefully extracting details about Richard's colleagues, his friends, his projects. Claire grew tired as the conversation continued, her earlier sharpness fading into exhaustion. Finally, the nurse returned, indicating that it was time for Claire's medication and rest. As Sarah prepared to leave, Claire reached out and grasped her hand with surprising strength. Detective Chen, she said, her eyes urgent. Find out who did this to my family. Find out why. I've waited 26 years. I need to know the truth before I die. I will, Sarah promised. I won't stop until I have answers. Driving back to Seattle through the rain, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just scratched the surface of something much darker than a simple missing persons case. An architect who knew the airport's secrets. A hidden space that required professional construction knowledge. Bodies arranged with ritualistic symbols. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned, deliberate, perhaps even ceremonial. And whoever had done it was still out there somewhere, watching to see if their carefully constructed secret would finally come to light. The Seattle FBI field office occupied several floors of a downtown high-rise, its windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Sarah had requested the meeting with Special Agent David Park, who had headed the original federal investigation into the Brennan disappearance back in 1998. Now retired from active fieldwork, Park served as a consultant on cold cases, his institutional memory invaluable for cases that spanned decades. He met Sarah in a small conference room, carrying a worn cardboard box that he set heavily on the table between them. Park was in his late 60s now, his hair completely white, but his eyes remained sharp and analytical. "I pulled everything when you called," he said, settling into a chair. 26 years, and I still remember this case like it was yesterday. It was the one that got away. Sarah opened the box and began sorting through files. "Walk me through what happened from the federal perspective. The local police reports are thorough, but I know the FBI conducted a parallel investigation." Park leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We got involved immediately because of the interstate nature of the disappearance. 2 people vanished during a flight from Washington to Massachusetts. That made it our jurisdiction. We interviewed everyone connected to Richard and Owen Brennan, family, friends, colleagues. We investigated Richard's finances, looking for any sign of planning or preparation. We found nothing." "What about Richard's work history, his background?" "Clean. Almost suspiciously clean. Richard Brennan was the kind of man who paid his taxes on time, never got a speeding ticket, volunteered at his son's school. He had a successful architecture firm specializing in transportation infrastructure, airports, train stations, that sort of thing. Well respected in his field." Sarah pulled out a photograph from the box, showing Richard Brennan at what appeared to be a professional conference. He was in his early 40s, handsome in an understated way, with the kind of face that inspired trust. "Claire mentioned a phone call Richard received 2 days before the flight," Sarah said. "Someone from his past asking for money. Did that come up in your investigation?" Park frowned, reaching for a file. He flipped through pages of interview transcripts. "Claire mentioned it in her 3rd interview with us, but she couldn't provide any useful details. We pulled Richard's phone records, both his cell and the home landline. There were dozens of calls in the week before Christmas. Work associates, family members, holiday arrangements. We tracked down every number we could. None of them seemed suspicious. But you couldn't account for all of them. A few calls came from pay phones. Not unusual for 1998. People used them all the time. Without knowing what we were looking for, there was no way to determine which call Claire was referring to, or if it was even significant." Sarah made notes, then pulled out the photographs from the hidden space. She slid them across the table to Park, watching his reaction carefully. The agent's face went pale. He picked up the first photograph, studying it intently, then moved through the rest of the stack. When he finished, he set them down with a hand that shook slightly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "They were there the whole time, right under our noses." "Look at the symbols on the floor," Sarah said, pointing to one of the images. "The medical examiner's office is analyzing them now, but preliminary assessment suggests they're protective sigils, possibly occult in nature." Park pulled the photograph closer, his expression troubled. "This changes everything. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a murder. Premeditated. Ritualistic. Someone with construction knowledge," Sarah added. "Someone who could build a false wall in a busy airport terminal without attracting attention. Someone who knew the building well enough to hide bodies in a space that wouldn't be discovered for decades." Park met her eyes. "Richard knew the building. He worked on Terminal B renovations." "I know, which means either Richard was a victim of someone who shared his professional knowledge, or Richard was involved somehow," Park finished grimly. "You think it's possible he built that space himself? That he was planning something?" Sarah pulled out another file, this one containing Richard's professional history. His firm handled the 1993 renovation of Terminal B, North Concourse. The project involved structural modifications, new gate configurations, updated mechanical systems. Richard was the lead architect. "But why would he seal himself and his son behind a wall?" Park demanded. "That makes no sense." "Unless someone else sealed them in," Sarah replied quietly. "Someone who knew about the space because Richard had shown them, Or someone who discovered it after Richard created it. Park stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the view into abstract patterns of gray and silver. When we investigated in 1998, he said slowly, we looked at Richard's professional associates. His firm had 4 partners besides Richard. We interviewed all of them. None raised red flags. I need those names, Sarah said, and any contractors or construction workers who were involved in that 1993 renovation. Park turned back to her. That's going to be a long list, and most of them will be difficult to track down after 26 years. People retire, move away, die. I don't care how long it takes. Park returned to the table and pulled out a thick folder. Personnel records from the renovation project. The firm kept meticulous documentation. Richard was apparently very particular about that. Sarah opened the folder and began scanning the names. Dozens of workers, contractors, subcontractors. It would take weeks to track them all down, even with federal resources. Then a name caught her eye. She stopped, reading the entry again. David, look at this. Park leaned over her shoulder. The entry was for a subcontractor named Thomas Verne, hired for specialized carpentry work during the 1993 renovation. Under contract duration, someone had written, terminated early, December 15, 1993, see incident report. What incident report? Sarah asked. Park flipped through the folder until he found a paper-clipped bundle of documents. He pulled out a single page, its edges yellowed with age. The report was brief, clinical. On December 15, 1993, Thomas Verne had been escorted from the construction site by airport security after an altercation with another worker. The nature of the altercation wasn't specified, but the result was clear. Immediate termination and a ban from all future airport construction projects. There's a note at the bottom, Park said, pointing. Written by Richard Brennan himself. Sarah read the handwritten addendum. Richard's script was neat, precise. Mr. Verne's behavior raised serious concerns about his mental stability. He made disturbing statements about the nature of the work and claimed to have discovered sacred geometry within the building structure. Recommend permanent ban from all our projects. Sacred geometry, Sarah said softly. The symbols on the floor around the bodies. They're geometric patterns. Park's expression had gone very still. We need to find Thomas Verne. Sarah was already pulling out her phone, dialing the cold case unit's research analyst. As she waited for the connection, she studied the photograph from the hidden space again. The symbols, the positioning of the bodies, the deliberate construction of a secret tomb within an airport terminal. This wasn't just murder. This was something else, something that had been carefully planned and executed by someone who believed they were doing more than simply killing 2 people. They were performing a ritual. And Richard Brennan, who had designed the space itself, might have been either the architect of his own death or its unwitting victim. The research analyst answered, and Sarah rattled off instructions to run Thomas Verne through every database available. Criminal records, DMV, Social Security, death records, everything. As she hung up, Park was already on his own phone, calling in favors from active agents who could access federal databases that Sarah's local jurisdiction couldn't touch. They worked in focused silence for the next hour, making calls, sending emails, building a timeline and a profile of a man who had been fired from an airport construction project 31 years ago, and then apparently vanished from the official record. Finally, Park's phone rang. He answered, listened, made notes, and hung up with a grim expression. They found him, he said. Thomas Verne, age 68. Last known address is a rural property about 90 miles. North of Seattle, near the town of Darrington. No criminal record since 1993, but he's been off the grid. No tax returns filed in 15 years, no property transactions, no digital footprint. Is he alive? Unknown. The property is still in his name, but county records show no activity. No utilities connected, no mail delivery. Sarah stood, already gathering the files. We need to go there, now. Park nodded. I'll call for backup. If Verney is our suspect, we don't know what we're walking into." As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the photographs from the hidden space. Richard and Owen Brennan, sealed away in darkness, surrounded by symbols that were supposed to protect or contain something. What had Thomas Verne believed he was doing? And more importantly, had he finished what he started? Or was there still more to his work? The questions followed Sarah as they left the federal building and headed north, driving through rain that had turned from drizzle to downpour, as if the sky itself knew they were approaching something dark. The road to Darrington wound through dense forest, climbing into the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Sarah drove while Park navigated, both of them silent as they left the suburbs behind and entered wilderness. 2 FBI agents followed in a second vehicle, their presence a necessary precaution for confronting a potential suspect in such an isolated location. The rain had lessened to a steady mist by the time they turned onto a narrow gravel road marked only by a faded number on a leaning post. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little daylight remained in the late afternoon. "According to county records," Park said, studying a map on his tablet, "the property is about 2 miles down this road. 40 acres, purchased by Thomas Verne in 1987. The only structure listed is a single-family residence, approximately 1,200 square feet." Sarah navigated carefully around potholes and washouts. The road clearly hadn't been maintained in years. Blackberry brambles encroached from both sides, scraping against the car's paint. Finally, they emerged into a clearing. Sarah stopped the car, and they both stared at what lay before them. The house was a low-slung rancher with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but it was the yard that made Sarah's breath catch. Scattered across the overgrown grass were dozens of wooden structures, some as small as birdhouses, others as large as sheds. All of them were covered in carved symbols, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe in the gray light. "Christ," Park muttered. "It's like a sculpture garden from hell." The second FBI vehicle pulled up behind them, and the 2 agents emerged, hands instinctively moving towards their sidearms. Agent Rodriguez, a compact woman with sharp eyes, approached Sarah's window. "What are we looking at, Detective?" "Possible suspect location in a 26-year-old homicide," Sarah replied. "Suspect may be dangerous, definitely unstable. We proceed with caution." They approached the house in standard formation, Sarah and Park taking the front while Rodriguez and her partner, Agent Chen, circled to the back. The wooden structures in the yard loomed on either side like silent witnesses, their carved symbols seeming to follow Sarah's movement. The front door hung slightly ajar. Sarah knocked, calling out, "Thomas Verne, this is the Seattle Police Department. We need to speak with you." No response, only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant call of a crow. Sarah pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior of the house was a single large room, its walls covered floor to ceiling with papers, blueprints, diagrams, newspaper clippings, photographs, all of them connected by lines of red string, creating a web of information that made Sarah's head spin. Park entered behind her, his own flashlight sweeping across the chaos. "It's like a conspiracy theorist's dream," he said quietly. But as Sarah's eyes adjusted and she began to make sense of the organization, she realized it wasn't random at all. This was research, obsessive, meticulous research. The wall to her left was dedicated entirely to airports. Blueprints of Seattle-Tacoma, but also LAX, O'Hare, JFK, Heathrow. Each blueprint was marked with symbols, geometric patterns highlighted in different colors. The wall to her right showed photographs, hundreds of them, missing persons cases from across the country, spanning decades, men, women, children. All of them disappeared from airports. And in the center of the back wall, larger than any other image, was a photograph of Richard and Owen Brennan, their official missing persons photo, the one that had been shown on news broadcasts in 1998. Someone had drawn symbols around their faces in red ink, the same symbols that had been found on the floor of their hidden tomb. "Sarah," Park called from the corner of the room. "You need to see this." She joined him in front of a desk covered with notebooks. Park had opened one, revealing page after page of handwritten text. The script was tiny, cramped, barely legible. But as Sarah leaned closer, she could make out fragments of sentences. The geometries align at the solstice. Blood offering required to seal the gate. Terminal B was built on sacred ground. The builders knew but hid the truth. Richard understands now, though he fought me at first. Sarah felt her skin crawl. "This is a confession." "It's more than that," Park said, flipping through more pages. "It's a manifesto. Verne believed airports were built on sites of spiritual power. He thought he could harness that power through ritual sacrifice and sacred architecture." Agent Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got something in the back. You need to come see this." Sarah and Park exited through the back door into a yard that had been cleared of trees. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure larger than the others, roughly the size of a small garage. Unlike the weathered buildings in the front yard, this one looked newer, its wood still fresh. Rodriguez stood near the entrance, a heavy padlock hanging broken at her feet. Door was locked, but the wood was rotted. "We forced it. You're not going to believe what's inside." Sarah approached the building and stepped through the doorway. The interior was lit by a battery-powered lantern that Rodriguez had already activated. The light revealed a workshop that was disturbingly professional. Carpentry tools hung in neat rows on the walls. A table saw, still dusty with sawdust, occupied one corner, and along the back wall were architectural drawings, pinned and labeled. But it was the center of the room that made Sarah stop in her tracks. A wooden structure, partially completed, stood like a skeleton in the middle of the workshop. It was a frame, roughly 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, designed to fit within a larger space. Sarah recognized it immediately from the photographs of the hidden tomb in Terminal B. This was a mock-up, a practice run. "He built the wall that sealed Richard and Owen," Park said, moving to examine the structure. "This is where he tested the design." Sarah noticed something else. Along one wall of the workshop, arranged on shelves, were personal items: shoes, watches, wallets, glasses, each one carefully labeled with a name and a date. She moved closer, reading the labels. Patricia Holmes, 1989, Denver. Michael Chen, 1991, Chicago. Sarah Martinez, 1995, Los Angeles. There were dozens of them, each representing a missing person. Each disappeared from an airport. "He didn't stop with Richard and Owen," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "This is a serial killer's trophy collection." Park was already on his radio, calling for a full forensic team and additional agents. "We need this entire property treated as a crime scene. I want every item cataloged, every notebook photographed. This is bigger than we thought." As agents began to arrive and the clearing filled with activity, Sarah stood in the workshop, staring at the partial wall frame. Thomas Verne had spent decades killing people in airports, hiding them in spaces he created within the buildings themselves. Richard Brennan hadn't been his first victim. He might not even have been his last. But where was Verne now? The house had been abandoned, though recently. The sawdust in the workshop was fresh, the battery in the lantern new. Verne had been here within the last few weeks, perhaps days. Sarah walked back outside and surveyed the property. In the fading light, she could see that the wooden structures in the front yard weren't random. They were arranged in a pattern, forming the same geometric symbols that had surrounded Richard and Owen's bodies. The entire property was a ritual site, and somewhere Thomas Verne was still alive, still active, still believing in whatever dark purpose had driven him to kill for 30 years. As night fell and portable lights were set up around the property, Sarah pulled out her phone and called the airport maintenance director, Marcus Webb. "Marcus, I need you to check something for me," she said when he answered. "Are there any active renovation projects at the airport right now? Any sections being demolished or rebuilt?" She heard the rustle of papers as Marcus checked. Actually, yes. The old baggage claim area in Terminal A is being gutted. They started demolition 2 weeks ago. Sarah's blood went cold. Stop the work, right now. Don't let anyone touch anything until I get there. Detective, what's going on? Just do it. I'm on my way. She hung up and turned to Park. He's not finished. Vern is still building his tombs, and I think I know where he's going to strike next. The airport was nearly empty when Sarah arrived just after midnight. The Christmas lights that decorated the terminals seemed garish and inappropriate now, their cheerful colors at odds with the darkness she was chasing. Marcus Webb met her at the security checkpoint, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. I stopped the renovation work like you asked, he said as they hurried through the deserted corridors. The crew wasn't happy about it, but I told them it was a safety issue. What's really going on, Detective? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Park and the FBI team were still at the Darrington property, coordinating with forensic specialists who would spend days cataloging Thomas Vern's House of Horrors. But Sarah couldn't wait. The fresh sawdust in Verna's workshop, the new battery in the lantern. These weren't signs of a cold case. They were signs of an active threat. They reached Terminal A's old baggage claim area, now sealed off with construction barriers and plastic sheeting. Marcus unlocked a temporary door, and they stepped into a space that looked like it had been frozen in time. The old conveyor belts were still in place, though covered in dust and debris. Sections of wall had been torn away, revealing the building's skeleton of steel beams and concrete. Where exactly were they working? Sarah asked, shining her flashlight across the cavernous space. Marcus led her to the far wall, where a large section of drywall had been removed. This whole wall is coming down. It's not load-bearing, so they were going to demolish it and reconfigure the space. Sarah approached the exposed wall cavity and felt her pulse quicken. Between the studs, she could see deeper into the wall structure than should have been possible. Someone had created a void space, just like in Terminal B. Get me a crowbar, she said. Marcus retrieved one from a nearby tool cart. Sarah wedged it into the drywall and pulled. The material came away easily, too easily, revealing a hollow space that extended several feet back into the wall, and there, in the beam of her flashlight, she saw them. 2 bodies seated against the back wall, their forms mummified and still. An adult woman and a teenage girl, both wearing clothes from the early 2000s. And on the floor around them, drawn in what appeared to be chalk, were the same geometric symbols that had surrounded Richard and Owen Brennan. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand over his mouth. Sarah forced herself to move closer, her training overriding her revulsion. She photographed everything with her phone, documenting the scene before touching anything. The woman's purse lay beside her body. Sarah carefully opened it, searching for identification. She found a wallet containing a driver's license for Patricia Holmes, issued in Colorado, expired in 2003. The name matched one of the labels in Vern's workshop. Call 911, Sarah told Marcus, her voice steady despite the horror before her. Tell them we have a crime scene. Then I need you to pull up your security footage from the past 2 weeks, every camera in this terminal. As Marcus made the call, Sarah studied the hidden space more carefully. The construction was professional, seamless. Without demolition, no one would have known this void existed. Vern had been building these tombs for decades, hiding victims in plain sight within some of the world's busiest buildings. But why? The notebooks at his house had suggested a twisted belief system involving sacred geometry and spiritual power. But the reality of standing before his victims made such rationalizations seem obscene. These were people. A mother and daughter who had disappeared 21 years ago, their families still waiting for answers. Sarah's phone rang. Park's name appeared on the screen. We found something else at the property, Park said without preamble. A journal, more recent than the others. Vern has been tracking airport renovations across the country. Every time a building is scheduled for demolition, he panics. He's afraid his work will be discovered. It is being discovered, Sarah replied. I'm standing in Terminal A looking at 2 more bodies, Patricia Holmes and her daughter from the 2003 Denver disappearance. Park swore softly. There's more, Sarah. The journal mentions a final completion. Verne believes that airports built during the winter solstice have special significance. He's been planning something for December 21st. That's 3 days from now. Sarah felt ice spread through her veins. What kind of completion? The journal isn't clear, but he references a living seal and the architect's return. There are also calculations, measurements for Terminal B at SeaTac. I think he's planning to come back there. Richard Brennan designed Terminal B, Sarah said slowly. Verne's journal mentioned that Richard understood something. What if Verne thinks Richard's involvement wasn't just coincidental? What if he believes Richard was part of his ritual somehow? Then the architect's return might mean he's looking for another architect, Parky said. Someone currently working on airport renovations. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Marcus Webb mentioned that the Terminal B renovation has a project lead, an architect overseeing the modernization work. She turned to Marcus, who had just finished his call with 911. Who's the lead architect on the Terminal B project? Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. Angela Reeves. She's been with the project for about 6 months. Why? I need her address. Now. As Marcus provided the information, Sarah was already moving toward the exit. Park, I'm heading to the architect's home. Get units there as backup. If Verne is planning a final ritual, he may need another victim. Someone connected to the original site. She ran through the airport corridors, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Outside, she jumped into her car and peeled out of the parking lot. Marcus's directions to Angela Reeves's apartment building programmed into her GPS. The city streets were empty at this hour, Christmas decorations glowing in windows as Sarah sped past. She tried calling Angela Reeves directly, but the phone rang to voicemail. She left a message, trying to keep her voice calm while urging the woman to call back immediately. The apartment building was in Belltown, a modern high-rise with a doorman and security cameras. Sarah badged her way past the night security guard and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Apartment 1407. She knocked hard, calling out Angela's name. No answer. Sarah had the building manager unlock the door, her hand on her service weapon as they entered. The apartment was dark, undisturbed. Sarah moved through each room quickly, finding no signs of struggle or forced entry. But on the kitchen counter, she found a cell phone plugged into a charger and a purse containing Angela Reeves's wallet and keys. She's here somewhere, Sarah muttered. Or she left in a hurry without her personal items. She checked the bedroom closet more carefully and noticed that a suitcase was missing from the top shelf. Visible dust marks showed where it had been. Some clothes were gone too, hangers pushed to one side. Back in the living room, she found a desk with a laptop. Sarah opened it, finding it still logged in. The most recent browser history showed flight information, a ticket purchased 3 days ago for a red-eye flight to Boston, departing tonight at 11:47 p.m. Sarah checked her watch. 12:43 a.m. The flight would have already taken off. She pulled out her phone and called airport operations, identifying herself and requesting passenger manifest information for the Boston flight. As she waited, a terrible suspicion began to form. The operator came back on the line. Detective Chen, I have the manifest. Angela Reeves was listed as a passenger in seat 14A, the same seat number that Richard Brennan had occupied 26 years ago. Was she on the plane when it took off? Sarah demanded. According to our records, yes, her boarding pass was scanned at 11:32 p.m. I need you to contact that flight immediately. Confirm that Angela Reeves is actually in her seat. There was a pause, then keyboard clicking. Detective, I'm being told the flight is not responding to radio contact. They missed their last scheduled check-in at 12:15 a.m. Sarah felt her world tilt. Get me the flight path and the last known position, now! As the operator scrambled to comply, Sarah ran from the apartment, already calling Park. It's happening now, she said when he answered. Angela Reeves was on a flight to Boston, the same flight number that Richard and Owen took, and the plane isn't responding to contact. Jesus Christ, Park breathed. How is that possible? Vern can't hijack a plane. He doesn't need to hijack it. He just needs to be on it. Sarah reached her car and started the engine, her mind working furiously. The flight attendants on the original Brennan disappearance said all passengers were accounted for. But what if someone was hiding? What if Vern built another space, this time on the plane itself? Commercial aircraft are inspected constantly, Park protested. There's no way to build a hidden compartment without someone noticing. Unless you worked for an airline maintenance contractor, Sarah said. Unless you had access to aircraft during renovations or modifications. She pulled up Vern's employment history on her phone while driving, scanning through the documents Park had compiled. There, in 1997, Thomas Vern had worked for a company that did interior refurbishment on commercial aircraft. He'd been fired after 6 months for unauthorized modifications to the work. He's been planning this for decades, Sarah said. Every piece was put in place years in advance. The hidden spaces in airports, the victims selected from passenger manifests, and now a final ritual that mirrors the original crime. The operator came back on her other line. Detective, the flight's last known position was over the Olympic Peninsula, heading toward the Pacific. But I have an update. The pilot just radioed in. They're experiencing severe mechanical issues and are making an emergency landing at Portland International. Get me on the phone with airport security at Portland, Sarah ordered. Tell them this is a federal emergency and they need to detain all passengers when that plane lands, especially anyone matching Thomas Vern's description. She merged onto I-5, heading south toward Portland at dangerous speeds, her emergency lights flashing. Park was coordinating with FBI offices in Oregon, arranging for agents to meet the plane. But as Sarah drove through the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Thomas Vern had spent 30 years perfecting his ritual, his twisted belief system demanding blood and sacred geometry to seal whatever gates he believed existed in these liminal spaces. The winter solstice was in 3 days, and somewhere in the darkness above, a plane was falling from the sky, carrying an architect and a killer toward an ending that had been written decades ago. Portland International Airport's emergency response vehicles surrounded the incoming aircraft as it touched down on the runway, its landing gear barely holding as the plane decelerated with alarming roughness. Sarah stood in the airport operations center, watching through the windows as the crippled aircraft finally came to a stop. Fire trucks and ambulances converged immediately, while armed FBI agents took positions around the plane. She had made the 2.5-hour drive to Portland in just under 2 hours, arriving only moments before the emergency landing. Park stood beside her, both of them connected to multiple phone lines coordinating the response. Evacuation is beginning, the Portland Airport security chief announced, watching his monitors. Passengers deploying via emergency slides. Sarah watched the tiny figures emerging from the aircraft, sliding down the inflatable chutes to waiting emergency personnel. Each passenger was being directed toward a secure holding area where FBI agents would interview them and check identifications. How many passengers total? Park asked. Manifest shows 83 passengers and 6 crew members, the security chief replied. The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency. Within 15 minutes, all passengers and crew had been removed from the aircraft. FBI agents began the systematic process of identification and questioning while structural engineers examined the plane's damage. Sarah's phone rang. Agent Rodriguez, who had coordinated the passenger screening. "We've interviewed everyone," Rodriguez said. "No one matching Thomas Vern's description, no one using his name or known aliases. And Detective, Angela Reeves isn't here." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean she isn't there? Her boarding pass was scanned. She got on that plane." "I'm telling you, she's not among the passengers we evacuated. We've accounted for everyone on the manifest except her." Sarah turned to Park. "We need to search that aircraft, now!" They moved quickly, joining the structural engineers and FBI agents who were boarding the plane through the forward door. The interior was in chaos. Overhead compartments hanging open, emergency equipment deployed. the smell of burning electronics heavy in the air. Sarah moved methodically down the aisle, checking seat numbers. 14A. The seat was empty, as were the seats around it. She questioned a flight attendant who had stayed with the response team. "Did you see the passenger in 14A during the flight?" Sarah asked. The attendant, a woman in her 50s with ash blonde hair, shook her head. "I remember noticing that seat was empty during the safety demonstration. I assumed she missed the flight, even though her boarding pass was scanned. It happens sometimes. People board, then decide they need to use the restroom and miss the door closure." "But you never saw her board?" "No. The flight was about 3/4 full, so I didn't think much about one empty seat." Sarah moved to the rear of the aircraft, examining every row, every overhead compartment, every possible space large enough to conceal a person. Nothing seemed out of place until she reached the very back of the plane, near the lavatories. Park was examining the wall panel between two lavatories, his flashlight revealing something that made him call Sarah over urgently. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the seam where two panels met. "This isn't standard. The gap is wider than it should be." Sarah ran her fingers along the seam, feeling the slight irregularity. "Can we remove this panel?" One of the structural engineers produced tools and carefully began removing the screws securing the panel. As the panel came away, it revealed a hollow space behind it, roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And inside, wedged into the cramped space, was Angela Reeves. She was alive but unconscious, her wrists and ankles bound with zip ties, a gag in her mouth. Paramedics were called immediately, and Angela was carefully extracted from the hidden compartment. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Sarah noticed something else in the space. A backpack, deliberately placed beside where Angela had been hidden. Sarah carefully pulled it out and opened it. Inside were notebooks, similar to those found at Vern's house, but these were different, more focused, more specific. They contained detailed plans of Terminal B, with annotations about the winter solstice, about completion rituals, about the architect's willing return. There was also a photograph, recent and clear, showing Angela Reeves entering the airport. Someone had been watching her, studying her movements. But the most disturbing item in the backpack was a small digital recorder. Sarah pressed play, and Thomas Vern's voice filled the air, calm and measured. "To whoever finds this, know that the work is nearly complete. The architect Angela Reeves was supposed to seal the final gate, but I see now that the original architect's sacrifice was sufficient." Richard Brennan understood, in his final moments, that he was building something greater than himself. His son was the blood price. His body was the seal. And on the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its lowest point, the geometries will align perfectly. Terminal B will become what it was always meant to be, a doorway held closed by the willing dead. The recording continued, Vern's voice taking on an almost reverent quality. "I spent 30 years creating these seals across the country. Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston. Every major airport built on the convergence points needed its guardians. But Seattle was the first. Seattle was where I discovered the truth hidden in the blueprints, the sacred mathematics that the original builders encoded into the structure itself." Sarah felt sick, listening to the recording, but she couldn't stop. Vern's madness had a terrible logic to it, a comprehensive delusion that had driven him to murder dozens of people. Angela Reeves would have completed the circle, but I realize now that her death isn't necessary. The airplane itself will serve. Flight 2547, the same number that carried Richard and Owen, making the same journey. When it falls from the sky tonight, the circuit will be complete. The winter solstice will arrive with all gates sealed, all guardians in place. The recording ended abruptly. Park was already on his phone, ordering a complete search of the aircraft. "He sabotaged this plane," he said to Sarah. "He wanted it to crash." The structural engineer who had been examining the plane's systems approached them, his face grim. "We found the problem. Someone deliberately damaged the hydraulic lines in the landing gear assembly. The pilots managed an emergency landing. But if we'd been another 15 minutes in the air, the gear would have failed completely. When could this damage have occurred? Sarah asked. Had to be during the pre-flight maintenance check. Someone with access to the aircraft and knowledge of its systems. Sarah had airport security pull up footage from the gate area during the boarding process. They watched as passengers filed onto the plane, as crew members conducted their checks. And then, at 11:18 p.m., a maintenance worker in coveralls approached the aircraft, exchanging words with a gate agent before boarding through a service entrance. The security chief enhanced the image, zooming in on the maintenance worker's face. It was Thomas Verne, aged and weathered but unmistakable. He used fake credentials to access the plane, Park said. Probably had them prepared years ago. He sabotaged the landing gear, hid Angela Reeves in the wall compartment he'd built during his time with the airline contractor, and then left. He wanted the plane to crash on the anniversary of Richard Brennan's disappearance, completing his ritual. But it didn't crash, Sarah said. The pilot saved it, which means Verne's ritual failed. Park pulled out his phone, checking the date. It's December 22nd. We're past the solstice. Even if Verne tries again, his timing is off. Sarah shook her head, a terrible certainty settling over her. He won't try again. His whole belief system depended on perfect timing, perfect geometry. If the ritual failed, if we discovered his work before completion— She didn't finish the sentence, but Park understood. You think he'll kill himself? I think he already has. Or he's planning to. We need to get back to Seattle, now. They left Portland as Angela Reeves was being transported to the hospital. She had been drugged, but was stable, with no apparent injuries beyond the trauma of being hidden in a cramped space for hours. She would survive, and with her survival, Verne's grand design had crumbled. Sarah and Park drove through the pre-dawn darkness, racing back to Seattle as the sky began to lighten in the east. The winter solstice had passed. The darkest day of the year was over, and daylight was returning. When they reached Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the sun was just breaking over the Cascades, casting long shadows across the runways. Sarah drove directly to Terminal B, to the sealed section where Richard and Owen Brennan had spent 26 years behind a wall. The construction barriers were still in place, the crime scene tape undisturbed. But as Sarah and Park approached, they saw that the door to the sealed corridor hung open. Sarah drew her weapon and entered cautiously. The corridor was dark, lit only by her flashlight. She followed it to the place where the false wall had been removed, where the bodies had been discovered. And there, seated on the floor in the exact spot where Richard Brennan's body had been found, was Thomas Verne. He was dead, his body already cold. In his lap was a notebook open to the final page, and beside him lay an empty bottle of pills. Sarah holstered her weapon and approached carefully. She read the final entry in Verne's notebook, his handwriting shaky but legible. The geometries were perfect. The sacrifices were willing, though they didn't know it. But I failed to account for human resilience, for the simple fact that sometimes planes don't crash when they're supposed to. Sometimes rituals fail not because of flawed design, but because the universe doesn't care about our designs. Richard Brennan tried to tell me this 31 years ago when I first showed him what I'd discovered in the airport's blueprints. He called me insane. He threatened to report me. I had to make him understand, had to make him part of the work. But even in death, even sealed behind the wall with his son, he resisted. I could feel it. The gates aren't sealed. They were never real. I spent my life building tombs for people who deserved to live, all because I believed in mathematics that were only ever just numbers. I'm sorry. Sarah stepped back, letting the crime scene photographers document everything. As they worked, she walked out of Terminal B and stood in the early morning light, watching planes take off and land, watching travelers hurry through the terminal with their luggage and their plans. Thomas Verne had died believing his life's work had meaning, had purpose. But, in the end, he had died knowing it was all a delusion, a pattern he'd imposed on random chance and architectural coincidence. The families of his victims would finally have answers. Patricia Holmes and her daughter would be returned to their family in Denver. Richard and Owen Brennan would be properly buried. Angela Reeves would recover and return to her work, designing buildings that were just buildings, nothing more. And Sarah would write her reports, close the cases, and try to forget the geometric symbols that still seemed to dance in her peripheral vision when she closed her eyes. But she knew she never would. Claire Brennan died peacefully in her sleep on January 15th, 3 weeks after learning the truth about her husband and son. She had lived long enough to attend their funeral, long enough to see them laid to rest in a cemetery overlooking Puget Sound. At the service, she had thanked Sarah for giving her closure, for allowing her to finally grieve properly after 26 years of unknowing. Sarah stood at the back of the small gathering, watching as Claire's few remaining friends and family paid their respects. Helen Moss, Richard's sister, had flown in from Boston. She approached Sarah after the service, her eyes red from crying. "They were supposed to be with me for Christmas," Helen said quietly. "I waited at that gate for hours, convinced there had been some mistake. I never imagined—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "No one could have imagined," Sarah replied. "Thomas Verne's delusions were so complete, so carefully constructed, that they seemed real even to him." The investigation had revealed the full scope of Verne's crimes. Over 31 years he had killed 47 people across the country, always in airports, always hidden in spaces he had built within the structures themselves. Some of the bodies had been discovered during the massive search that followed his death. Others remained sealed in walls and hidden compartments, waiting to be found during future renovations. Angela Reeves had recovered from her ordeal and returned to work, though she had transferred away from airport projects. She testified at the federal hearings that examined airport security and maintenance protocols, helping to implement new safeguards that would prevent anyone from exploiting structural renovations the way Verne had. Micah Carraway, the name Verne had used before abandoning his identity, was revealed to have been a brilliant but troubled architect who had suffered a psychotic break in the early 1980s. His family had lost touch with him, and he had drifted through various jobs before finding work in airport construction, where his delusions about sacred geometry and spiritual gateways had taken root and flourished. The notebooks found at his property and in his final hiding place revealed a mind that had constructed an entire mythology around airport architecture. He believed that the buildings were built on convergence points of mystical energy, that certain geometric patterns could open or seal doorways to other dimensions.